Let's rewind to 1809. Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks stand in a Kentucky wilderness so remote that neighbors lived miles away. On February 12th, a baby boy is born in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor and a hole for a window. His name is Abraham Lincoln, and almost everything about his early life would suggest he had no business becoming anything at all. His father was a poor farmer who knew nothing but how to barely survive. His mother was kind, but she would be dead before Abraham turned 10. The frontier life wasn't romantic or noble, it was grinding, dehumanizing poverty. The Lincolns moved constantly, chasing marginally better farming opportunities. First Kentucky, then Indiana, then Illinois. Each move represented a fresh start that never quite materialized. At this time in American history, education was a luxury for wealthy families. Schooling was rare, irregular, and often came at a cost poor families couldn't afford. Abraham Lincoln's total formal education amounted to about 4 months. 4 months. That's how much time he spent in actual classroom education. Everything else he learned came from his own hunger to understand the world. Here's what you need to understand about Lincoln's childhood. His lack of formal education became his greatest teacher. While other boys attended school and accepted what they were told, Lincoln had to figure things out for himself. He read everything he could find: the Bible, books about law, books about mathematics, books about history. He borrowed books from neighbors and walked miles to reach them. This wasn't because his parents pushed him, it was because something inside him demanded answers. His mother, Nancy Hanks, was the spiritual and intellectual heart of the family. She read to him when he was small, filling his mind with stories and ideas. She died in 1818 when Abraham was 9 years old. Her death crushed him. Years later, he would still talk about how his mother had sparked his imagination and kindled a love of learning that outlasted her life. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, who married his father a year after Nancy's death, recognized something special in the boy. While Thomas Lincoln didn't understand Abraham's hunger for books and learning, often viewing it as laziness, Sarah defended her stepson's need to read. She understood that he was reaching for something beyond the brutal limitations of frontier life. By the time Abraham was a teenager, he was a contradiction. His body was hardened by labor on the frontier. He could split logs, plow fields, and do the backbreaking work required for survival. But his mind was somewhere else entirely, consuming every scrap of knowledge he could find. He was lanky and awkward, growing to 6 feet 4 inches tall, a giant among frontier men. He was also miserably self-conscious about his appearance, his poor grammar, and his lack of social refinement. But here's the thing nobody tells you. His insecurity became his superpower. Because he felt like an outsider, he observed people carefully. He listened more than he talked. He learned to anticipate what others needed and wanted. He developed a sharp sense of humor to deflect attention from his awkwardness, humor that made people like him. Despite his strange appearance, at age 22, Abraham Lincoln left home for good. He had been forced into situations where he felt used by his father. Thomas Lincoln would hire out his son's labor and take the wages for himself, a legal right of fathers in that era. Abraham resented this deeply. He felt like property, not a son. The moment he was legally able to leave, he did. He moved to New Salem, Illinois, a small community where nobody knew him or his past. For the first time in his life, he could be whoever he wanted to become. He took various jobs: store clerk, surveyor, militia, soldier, never settling, but always learning. New Salem was transformative because it was his first real community. A place where people judged him on who he was, not where he came from. In New Salem, people noticed something about this tall, awkward stranger. He had integrity. If he said he would do something, he did it. He didn't cheat or cut corners. He was honest to a fault, even when honesty cost him money. Frontier society valued practical ability and trustworthiness. Lincoln had both. More importantly, in New Salem, Lincoln discovered his voice. He participated in debates about politics and philosophy. He performed skits and told stories that left people doubled over with laughter. He was elected to the militia. He studied mathematics and surveying, becoming a surveyor for the county. Slowly, impossibly, this boy from nowhere was becoming somebody. But New Salem was a dying town. As it declined, Lincoln realized he needed a bigger stage. In 1837, he made a decision that changed everything. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, and decided to become a lawyer. This is the part that most people don't fully appreciate. Lincoln was not born to a legal family. He had no connections to the legal world. He had no formal education whatsoever. Yet he decided that he would teach himself law well enough to practice it. For the next 2 years, Lincoln worked as a store clerk and surveyor while teaching himself law in every spare moment. He borrowed law books. He studied under John Stuart, an established lawyer in Springfield who saw potential in the strange, tall man with the penetrating eyes. In 1836, he was certified to practice law. By 1837, he was a full attorney. This pattern teaching himself what he needed to know, moving toward challenges instead of away from them, refusing to accept the limitations others placed on him would define Lincoln's entire life. He had already proven once that he could overcome impossible odds. He would prove it again and again. Let me give you 3 remarkable facts about Abraham Lincoln's rise to prominence in Springfield. First, he became one of the leading lawyers in Illinois, not through inheritance or family connections, but through relentless study and ethical practice. Judges knew they could trust him. Clients knew he would tell them the truth, even if the truth was that they didn't have a case. Second, he entered politics in 1834, running for the state legislature in his mid-20s, just 4 years after arriving in Illinois. He lost that first election. He ran again in 1836 and won. He served in the Illinois state legislature for 8 years, learning how government worked, making connections, and slowly, very slowly, building a reputation. Third, in 1842, he married Mary Todd, a wealthy, educated woman from Kentucky with significant social connections. Their marriage was complicated. Mary was strong-willed, and Lincoln was prone to periods of deep depression. But Mary believed in Abraham's potential in a way that helped propel him forward. In 1847, Abraham Lincoln was elected to the United States House of Representatives. At 41 years old, the boy from a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor was now a U.S. congressman. But here's what happened next. Lincoln's political career almost ended before it began. He took controversial positions on the Mexican-American War. He opposed the war, which was unpopular in Illinois. He served only one term in Congress from 1847 to 1849. He refused to run for re-election because he didn't think he could win. For a man with his ambition, it felt like failure. What followed was the darkest period of Lincoln's life before his presidency. From 1849 to 1854, he was essentially a political exile. He practiced law. He built a successful law practice, actually, but he was no longer in the political arena. He felt like he had his moment and blown it. Then something happened in 1854 that would pull Lincoln back into politics and set him on a collision course with destiny. Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether slavery would be legal. To Lincoln, this was unthinkable. The act essentially reopened the question of slavery's expansion, a question that Lincoln believed had been settled by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the way that some radicals were. He didn't believe the federal government had the right to abolish slavery where it already existed, but he was absolutely convinced that slavery should not expand into new territories. Slavery, to Lincoln, was morally wrong. It violated the founding principle that all men are created equal. He couldn't remain silent. In 1854, Lincoln re-entered politics. He initially joined the Whig Party and then helped found the Republican Party in Illinois. He became the voice of the anti-slavery expansion movement. He gave speeches that were logical, powerful, and increasingly famous. In 1858, Lincoln was nominated to run for the U.S. Senate against Stephen Douglas, one of the most powerful politicians in America. Lincoln was the underdog. Douglas was famous. But Lincoln's campaign included a series of debates with Douglas that would become legendary in American political history. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were intellectual duels, fought with words instead of weapons. In 7 debates across Illinois, Lincoln and Douglas clashed over slavery, the nature of democracy, and the future of the nation. Lincoln didn't win every argument, but he articulated a moral vision that resonated with people. The debates were transcribed and reprinted in newspapers. Lincoln's name became known far beyond Illinois. He lost the Senate race to Douglas, but the debates had made him a national figure. Republicans took notice. Here was a man who could articulate their principles with moral force and rhetorical power. Here was a man who understood the common people because he had been one of them. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was nominated for president. He wasn't the favorite. He didn't have the most political experience, but he had something that resonated with voters. Authenticity. He had actually lived the American dream, in the most literal sense imaginable. He had pulled himself up from poverty and ignorance to become one of the most respected lawyers and political voices in the nation, and he won. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, a man whose total formal education was for months, a man whose father once tried to claim the money he earned as a young adult, a man who had taught himself law, built himself a career, and educated himself about politics and philosophy through relentless reading. The American people had elected him, and in choosing him, they had unknowingly chosen a president perfectly suited for the catastrophe that was about to destroy the nation. In March 1861, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as President of the United States. He had no idea that in just 6 weeks, the nation would be at war with itself. Here's what Lincoln inherited: a nation tearing itself apart. When Lincoln won the election, 7 southern states seceded from the Union before he even took office. They formed the Confederate States of America. They were terrified that a Republican president would eventually abolish slavery. They didn't want to wait to find out. Lincoln's position was extraordinarily difficult. He believed slavery was wrong, but he also believed the Constitution protected slavery in states where it existed. He had been elected to prevent slavery's expansion, not to end it where it already existed. He wanted to preserve the Union. He wanted to avoid war. But the South had other plans. Lincoln's first major test came in April 1861, Fort Sumter. A federal military installation in South Carolina was running out of supplies. Lincoln decided to send a supply ship. The Confederacy saw this as an act of war. They fired on the fort. The Civil War had begun. In the days after Fort Sumter, Lincoln faced decisions that would define his presidency. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more states seceded in response. The nation was now irrevocably divided, and Lincoln held the fate of millions of people in his hands. But what nobody saw, what the public didn't fully understand, was Lincoln's internal turmoil. He had believed, genuinely believed, that war could be avoided. He had hoped that moderate voices in the South would prevail. He had prayed for a peaceful resolution. Now, he would have to oversee a war that would kill over 600,000 Americans before it ended. He would have to make decisions that would result in the deaths of young men who had never harmed him personally. He would carry the weight of those deaths for the rest of his life. Lincoln's approach to the presidency was fundamentally different from other presidents before or after. He created a cabinet known as a team of rivals, highly talented people who often disagreed with him. William Seward was Secretary of State and had been Lincoln's rival for the Republican nomination. Salmon Chase was Secretary of Treasury and also harbored presidential ambitions. Edwin Stanton was Secretary of War and initially despised Lincoln. Why did Lincoln do this? Because he wanted the best advice, even if that advice challenged him. He was secure enough in his own judgment to surround himself with strong personalities. He would listen to all sides of an argument, then make his own decision. This approach to leadership was revolutionary for its time. Lincoln wasn't interested in surrounding himself with yes men. He actually wanted people to push back against him, to challenge his thinking. He would attend cabinet meetings where Seward and Chase argued vigorously with each other. He would sit quietly, listening, thinking. Then he would make the decision. His generals were another matter. Lincoln had no formal military training. He was managing a massive war effort while learning about military strategy on the job. Some generals were brilliant. Ulysses S. Grant would eventually become his right hand. Others were political appointees or incompetent, or both. Lincoln fired generals who didn't perform. He promoted generals who showed promise. He studied military strategy intensely, reading books on the subject, learning from his generals, thinking deeply about how to conduct the war. He made mistakes. His involvement in the Peninsula Campaign was questionable, for instance, but he learned from his mistakes and adjusted. The war went badly at first. The Union Army lost major battles. Northerners grew impatient. They had expected the rebellion to be crushed quickly. By late 1861, it became clear the war would be long and devastating. Lincoln's popularity plummeted. Northern newspapers attacked him relentlessly. Congress questioned his leadership. His own cabinet members sometimes questioned his judgment. He received death threats. People called him weak, incompetent, and a fool. In late 1861 and early 1862, Abraham Lincoln experienced what we would now recognize as clinical depression. He spent hours alone in his office. He told friends that he would be glad if a cannonball would come through the window and put him out of his misery. He felt the weight of the war, the weight of the deaths, the weight of the nation's crisis pressing down on him. But he didn't give up. He didn't retreat. He kept showing up. He kept thinking. He kept trying to find a way to preserve the Union and end slavery. Speaking of slavery, this is where Lincoln's journey takes a crucial turn. For the first year of the war, Lincoln's stated goal was to preserve the Union with slavery intact. He believed that gradual emancipation with compensation to slaveholders was the best path forward. He couldn't move too far ahead of Northern public opinion, and the North in 1861 was not united behind abolition. But as the war progressed and the brutality increased, as thousands of young men died and the Union victory seemed uncertain, Lincoln's thinking evolved. He began to see slavery not just as a moral evil but as a strategic liability. Slaves in the South were supporting the Confederate war effort, providing labor for agriculture and infrastructure. If the Union could liberate those slaves, it would weaken the Confederacy and potentially add fighters to the Union cause. More than that, Lincoln began to believe that slavery's end had to be part of any lasting peace. A nation couldn't endure, half slave and half free, if freedom had any meaning at all. If he was going to save the Union by sacrificing so many lives, the sacrifice had to mean something. It had to lead to a genuinely new nation built on the principle that all men are created equal. In July 1862, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. He read it to his cabinet. Some urged him to issue it immediately. Others warned against it. Lincoln told them he would issue it after the next Union victory. He didn't want to appear desperate. The next victory came at Antietam in September 1862, the single bloodiest day in American military history. Nearly 25,000 casualties in one day. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was a Union win, and it was enough. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. It declared that all slaves in Confederate states were henceforth free. It was a military order, not a constitutional amendment. Critics said it didn't actually free any slaves because the Union didn't control the Confederate territories. And technically, they were right. But the Emancipation Proclamation was more than a military order. It was a statement of moral purpose. It transformed the war from a battle to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. The year 1863 was the turning point of the Civil War. In July, the Union won at Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, with over 50,000 casualties. In July, the Union also won at Vicksburg, securing control of the Mississippi River. The momentum was shifting. The Union was going to win this war. Lincoln was invited to speak at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery on November 19, 1863. The main speaker was Edward Everett, one of the most famous orators of the time. His speech lasted 2 hours. Then Lincoln was invited to say a few appropriate remarks. Lincoln rose and spoke for less than 3 minutes. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. These words, so simple and yet so profound, reframed the entire war. It wasn't about constitutional questions or the rights of states. It was about whether the fundamental promise of America could survive. It was about whether human freedom, once declared, could be protected and expanded. The Gettysburg Address was only 272 words. It was dismissed at the time. Newspapers didn't give it much attention. But over time, over the years and decades, it became recognized as one of the greatest speeches in American history. Lincoln had taken the brutal, grinding reality of a devastating war and invested it with meaning. By early 1864, it became clear that Lincoln would likely seek re-election. Political observers were uncertain whether he would run. The war was still costly. The Northern death toll continued to rise. Some of his own party wanted a different candidate, but Lincoln decided to run. He believed he had to see the war through to its conclusion. He couldn't hand over the presidency to someone else mid-war. In November 1864, Lincoln was re-elected, winning over 55% of the popular vote and 212 out of 233 electoral votes. What's remarkable is that in 1864, in the middle of the Civil War, the United States held a free election and peacefully transferred power according to constitutional provisions. In a nation tearing itself apart, democracy still functioned. That was remarkable. That was Lincoln. With his re-election secure, Lincoln moved toward his second-term agenda, ending slavery completely and beginning the process of Reconstruction. But slavery couldn't end without a constitutional amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. To truly end slavery, the Constitution itself had to be amended. Lincoln threw his political weight behind the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States. It passed Congress in January 1865. It would be sent to the states for ratification. By December 1865, enough states had ratified it. Slavery was officially, constitutionally, abolished in the United States. Lincoln had done it. He had preserved the Union. He had ended slavery. He had transformed the nation according to his moral vision. But here's what distinguished Lincoln as a leader: his approach to victory. Many in the North wanted revenge on the South. They wanted to punish the rebels, to impose harsh terms, to remake Southern society through force. Lincoln wanted reconciliation. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, he offered a vision of what the post-war nation could become: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us, to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations, with malice toward none. These words, spoken from a position of overwhelming power, as the North was winning the war definitively, showed extraordinary moral stature. Lincoln didn't gloat. He didn't demand vengeance. He looked toward peace and reconciliation. In April 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was effectively over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery had been abolished. The nation could begin the long process of healing. Lincoln had for years to govern. He spent the first year learning how to be president and making catastrophic military mistakes. He spent the second year discovering his moral authority and beginning to use it. He spent the third year consolidating power and beginning to see a path to victory. He spent the fourth year achieving victory and planning reconciliation. But he would never get to fully implement Reconstruction. He would never get to see whether his vision of reconciliation could actually work. On April 11, 1865, just 3 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech from the White House. He discussed his Reconstruction plans. He advocated for voting rights for black men in the South, particularly those who had fought in the Union Army. In the crowd, listening to this speech, was a man named John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and passionate Confederate sympathizer. Booth was planning something terrible. For the previous 4 years, Booth had watched with growing rage as his beloved South was crushed by Union forces. He had watched as slavery, the institution on which Southern society was built, was eradicated. He had watched as Lincoln stood triumphant over the ruins of the Confederacy. Booth decided that Lincoln had to die. If Lincoln died, perhaps the chaos that followed could benefit the South somehow. Perhaps it could disrupt Reconstruction. Perhaps it could be an act of vengeance against the man Booth blamed for the South's destruction. On April 14, 1865, 9 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary, went to Ford's Theater in Washington to watch a comedy called Our American Cousin. Lincoln loved theater. He loved comedy. For a few hours, he could escape the weight of the presidency and just be entertained. At approximately 10:15 p.m., John Wilkes Booth entered the president's box. He was carrying a small pistol. Lincoln was sitting in a rocking chair, watching the play, relaxed and off guard. Booth raised the pistol and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward. Mary rushed to hold him. Chaos erupted in the theater. Booth jumped from the box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process, then fled into the night. Lincoln was carried to a boarding house across the street. He lingered through the night, but he never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. The nation was devastated. The man who had preserved the Union, who had ended slavery, who had become the symbol of American democracy, was dead. Killed by an assassin's bullet just days after the war ended. Let me tell you what people noticed in the immediate aftermath. In the North, millions of people mourned. But it wasn't just sadness. It was a sense of betrayal, a sense that something magnificent had been taken away. Lincoln had represented hope. He had represented the possibility that the worst moment in American history could lead to something better. In the South, some people celebrated Booth had become a martyr in their eyes, a man who had struck back against Northern domination. But others in the South recognized something different. They recognized that Lincoln had been their only hope for lenient Reconstruction. With him gone, the North would be led by Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee man who had different ideas about how to treat the South. Over the following days and weeks, Lincoln's body was carried by train across the entire nation. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the tracks to pay their respects. They gathered at stops along the route. They stood in the snow and the rain. They wept. They understood that something epical had ended. Lincoln's funeral became a national ceremony. He was buried in Springfield, Illinois, the city where he had made his home. He was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, not far from the state capitol where he had served in the legislature decades before. What's remarkable about Lincoln's death is that it immediately elevated him to mythology. Within days of his assassination, he had become more than a president. He had become a symbol of the nation's struggle and redemption. He had become a figure of moral authority that transcended politics. But here's the profound tragedy. Lincoln died before he could implement his vision for Reconstruction. He died before he could prove that the North and South could be reunited with charity and magnanimity. He died before he could establish what genuine freedom would mean for formerly enslaved people. In many ways, this tragedy had a catastrophic impact on American history. Reconstruction became something far harsher than Lincoln had envisioned. The promises made to Black Americans were betrayed within a few years. The South entered a long period of oppression through Jim Crow laws that would last for over a century. If Lincoln had lived, would history have been different? We can't know. But we can know that the weight of his moral authority, exercised with restraint and wisdom, might have been enough to establish a different trajectory. Still, What Lincoln accomplished in his presidency was extraordinary. He held the nation together when it seemed certain to break apart. He ended slavery through constitutional amendment. He transformed the war from a struggle for union into a struggle for human freedom. He articulated a moral vision of American democracy that still resonates 150 years after his death. Let me try to explain who Abraham Lincoln actually was. This is important because Lincoln has become so mythologized that we often lose sight of the actual man. He was a man profoundly shaped by poverty and struggle. He never forgot what it was like to be nothing. He never forgot what it was like to be excluded, dismissed, underestimated. That shaped his empathy. That shaped his ability to connect with common people. He was a man of towering intellectual ambition who had to teach himself everything. He wasn't content with conventional wisdom. He questioned, investigated, and formed his own conclusions. He read Shakespeare for entertainment. He studied geometry late into the night. He devoured biographies and history. He was essentially an intellectual who had been forged in the frontier. He was a man of profound moral conviction, but not a moral absolutist. He believed slavery was wrong, but he also believed in working within constitutional constraints. He wanted to move as fast as possible toward freedom, but he was strategic about it. He wasn't interested in noble failure. He was interested in actual results. He was a man who understood the weight of power. He was deeply troubled by the decisions he had to make. He agonized over military strategy because he understood that each decision he made would result in deaths. He wasn't cavalier about violence or war. He used it as a last resort, but he used it decisively when he determined it was necessary. He was a man of humor and humility. He told jokes and anecdotes to deflect tension and put people at ease. He was willing to admit when he was wrong. He changed his mind when presented with better arguments. He appointed people who disagreed with him because he valued diverse perspectives. He was a man of deep faith, but not in a conventional way. He wasn't a member of any church for most of his life. He had questions about Orthodox Christianity, but he believed in God. He believed that history had moral meaning. He believed that the arc of history, though long, bent toward justice. Most importantly, Abraham Lincoln was a man of extraordinary character. By this, I don't mean that he was perfect. He wasn't. He was subject to depression. He had a difficult marriage. He made mistakes, militarily and politically. He could be stubborn, he could be indecisive, but he had integrity in the deepest sense. His word meant something. His principles, while flexible in their application, were not negotiable in their essence. He strived to do the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it cost him. This is why Lincoln matters. Not because he was perfect, not because he solved all of America's problems, but because in the moment of greatest crisis, faced with impossible choices, he chose the path that honored both justice and mercy. He chose to preserve the Union. He chose to end slavery. He chose to offer reconciliation without vengeance. In his speeches, particularly the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, Lincoln articulated a vision of American democracy that went beyond the Constitution, beyond politics, beyond war. He spoke about the fundamental principle that all people are created equal. He spoke about binding up wounds and beginning anew. Why do we still talk about Lincoln 160 years after his death? Why do Americans still argue about what he meant, what he believed, what he would have done? Because Lincoln's life and death forced America to answer fundamental questions about itself. What does it mean to be a free nation? What do we owe to people who have been enslaved? How do we reunite a divided people? How do we move forward after terrible trauma? These aren't questions that were answered in 1865 and put to rest. These are questions that each generation of Americans has to answer again. Lincoln showed us that these questions matter. He showed us that they're worth struggling over, worth dying for, worth living for. The boy from the one-room log cabin with a dirt floor became the man who held the nation together when it was tearing itself apart. He didn't do it perfectly, but he did it faithfully. He did it with moral seriousness. He did it with a recognition that the stakes were enormous, not just for the nation, but for human freedom itself. In 4 years as president, Abraham Lincoln transformed himself and his nation. He learned to be a president. He learned to wield power justly. He learned to hold together people of conflicting views and competing interests. He led a nation through its greatest trial and emerged with a vision of a better future. Abraham Lincoln never saw the America that his actions created. He never saw Reconstruction, for all its failures and promises. He never saw Black Americans educated and voting and participating in democracy, at least not in the way he had hoped. He never saw the United States become a more perfect union, dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. But his ideas didn't die with him. His words didn't fade away. The Gettysburg Address, those 272 words, spoken in less than 3 minutes, became the intellectual foundation for American civil rights for the next 100 years. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke about his dream of a nation where people were judged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He was echoing Lincoln's vision. The principles that Lincoln articulated, that human equality is a fundamental truth, not a negotiable opinion. That democracy requires sacrifice. That a nation cannot endure permanently divided against itself. These principles have guided America even in moments when Americans have failed to live up to them. Lincoln also transformed the presidency itself. He showed what an extraordinary president could do. He showed that a president could grow and change and learn. He showed that a president could hold together competing views while maintaining moral clarity. He showed that a president could use power justly, not for personal aggrandizement, but for noble purposes. The tragedy is that we never got to see what Lincoln's second term would have brought. We never got to see how he would have handled Reconstruction. We never got to see whether his vision of reconciliation could have created a genuinely different future. But perhaps that's also why Lincoln remains so compelling to us. His story is incomplete. His work was unfinished. He represents possibility cut short but not destroyed. When we look at Lincoln's life, what we see is the story of America itself. We see a poor boy with nothing becoming something. We see a person overcoming circumstances that seemed insurmountable. We see someone growing through struggle and challenge. We see someone who didn't let his past limit his future. We see someone who, when given power, used it to expand freedom rather than consolidate privilege. This is the American dream. Not that everyone becomes rich. Not that everyone becomes famous. But that everyone has the potential to grow, to transform themselves through work and determination. That's what Lincoln did. And that's why his story matters. Abraham Lincoln was born in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor. His mother died before he was 10. His father treated him as property. He had 4 months of formal education. Everything in his circumstances pointed toward a life of poverty and obscurity. But through relentless self-education, through moving toward challenges instead of away from them, through developing relationships based on honesty and integrity, this man pulled himself into the middle class. He became a lawyer. He became a politician. He became a president. He became one of the greatest leaders in human history. And when he finally had power, when he finally reached the presidency, he didn't use it for personal benefit. He didn't use it to punish his enemies or entrench his position. He used it to expand human freedom. He used it to challenge the nation to live up to its founding principles. This is what makes Lincoln so relevant to us today. We live in a time of division. We live in a time when Americans can barely seem to talk to each other across political divides. We live in a time when cynicism is high and faith in institutions is low. We look at our problems: racial injustice that traces back to slavery, a divided nation, inequality that persists from generation to generation, and we wonder if anything can change. Lincoln's life says that it can. His life says that leadership matters. His life says that moral courage matters. His life says that understanding the common humanity of people different from yourself matters. But here's the thing about Lincoln that we need to understand. He didn't succeed because he was brilliant or gifted in some supernatural way. He succeeded because he worked. He succeeded because he was humble enough to learn from others and secure enough to admit when he was wrong. He succeeded because he had principles but was flexible about implementation. He succeeded because he refused to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. These are qualities available to any of us. They're not reserved for people of genius or privilege. They're available to anyone willing to work for them, develop them, live them. When we remember Abraham Lincoln on this day, more than 150 years after his assassination, we remember more than just a historical figure. We remember a demonstration of what's possible. We remember a man who proved that your circumstances at birth don't have to define your life. We remember a man who used power to expand freedom rather than restrict it. We remember a man who refused to accept the limitations others placed on him. The 1863 Emancipation Proclamation and the 1865 13th Amendment weren't inevitable. Lincoln had to fight for them. He had to move Northern opinion gradually toward support for abolition. He had to convince his cabinet. He had to navigate the political obstacles. He had to maintain public support for a war that was extraordinarily costly. Similarly, the preservation of the Union wasn't inevitable. Lincoln could have let the South go. Plenty of people in the North were willing to let the Southern states secede. Lincoln could have focused on military victory alone without worrying about moral questions. Lincoln could have sought a negotiated peace that left slavery intact. But he didn't. He held the line. He kept the war focused on preserving the Union and ending slavery. He understood that these weren't separate goals. They were interconnected. You couldn't truly have a unified nation if that nation was built on the enslavement of millions of people. This is what we lose when we see Lincoln as just another historical figure, as just another face on a penny. We lose sight of the actual choices he made, the actual obstacles he overcame, the actual moment in history when things could have gone differently. If Lincoln had abandoned the war effort in 1862 when it looked like the North couldn't win, the Confederacy would have survived. Slavery would have persisted. The United States would have been divided into two nations. If Lincoln had accepted a peace settlement that left slavery intact, he could have spared hundreds of thousands of lives. He could have avoided the carnage of battles like Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Sherman's march to the sea. But he didn't take these easier paths. He persevered. He held on. He believed that the nation could be preserved and slavery could be ended, and that both of these goals were worth the sacrifice required. This is leadership. This is moral courage. This is what a person of character looks like when given power. And here's what's so striking about Lincoln. He never assumed he was right. He surrounded himself with people who disagreed with him. He listened to criticism. He changed his mind when he heard better arguments. He was open to learning even though he was the president, even though he had more power than almost anyone else in the nation. When his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who had initially despised Lincoln, worked with him through the war and then gave Lincoln one of the greatest tributes any leader has ever received. After Lincoln's death, when Stanton was shown Lincoln's body, he said simply, "Now he belongs to the ages." That was true then, and it's true now. Abraham Lincoln doesn't belong to just the 1860s. He doesn't belong to just the history books. He belongs to the ages. He belongs to every generation of Americans trying to figure out how to live together, how to extend freedom, how to preserve democracy. Every time we face a moment of crisis, we implicitly ask ourselves, what would Lincoln do? When we face moral questions that seem impossibly complicated, we return to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, to his second inaugural, to the speeches where he tried to articulate the deepest meanings of the American experiment. His words weren't unique. They weren't novel. They were simply profound expressions of truths that most Americans already believed at some level. But Lincoln said them with such clarity, such moral seriousness, such deep conviction that they became immortal. 77 years ago, with malice toward none, the last full measure of devotion. These phrases have become part of American consciousness. They represent something that we all aspire to, the possibility that we could lead with moral clarity, that we could face impossible challenges without losing our humanity, that we could expand freedom even at great cost. Lincoln died without completing his work. Reconstruction would not go as he hoped. Black Americans would face nearly a century of Jim Crow oppression after their emancipation. The wounds of the Civil War would take generations to heal. The work of creating a genuinely equal society would take far longer than anyone in 1865 imagined. But Lincoln set the direction. He planted the seeds. He made it impossible for America to ever fully embrace slavery again, or to deny the moral principle that all people are created equal. In the 160 years since Lincoln's death, America has struggled repeatedly to live up to the ideals he articulated. We had the Civil Rights Movement, fighting to extend the promises of the Emancipation Proclamation. We had women's suffrage, extending voting rights to half the population. We've had ongoing struggles for racial justice, economic equality, and genuine opportunity for all Americans. And in each of these struggles, people have returned to Lincoln. They've quoted him. They've invoked his memory. They've asked what Lincoln would have done. This tells us something profound. Lincoln created a standard against which America would be measured. By abolishing slavery and preserving the Union, he established that freedom is a fundamental value of American society. He established that we are supposed to be a nation where all people are treated as equals. Even though we've failed repeatedly to live up to that standard, that failure is painful. It's a testament to how difficult it is to actually live according to our ideals. But the failure also matters because it reminds us that we haven't achieved what Lincoln fought for. The work is not finished. The promise is not fully realized, and so Lincoln's life becomes a call to each generation. Finish the work, extend freedom further. Be honest about where we've fallen short. Have the courage to make the hard choices necessary to move closer to the ideals we profess. This is why a man who lived in the 1800s still speaks to us so powerfully today. He represents both the best of what we can be and a reminder of how far we still have to go. Let me ask you this. What would it have meant if Abraham Lincoln had given up? If that poor boy from Kentucky, facing a father who saw him as property, had accepted the limitations placed on him? If he had decided that education and improvement were beyond his reach? Then there would be no Emancipation Proclamation. There would be no Gettysburg Address. There would be no preservation of the Union. There would be no expansion of freedom. History would have been fundamentally different. But Lincoln didn't give up. He kept learning. He kept growing. He kept pushing forward. And when the moment came to use the power he had gained, he used it for freedom rather than power, for union rather than division, for moral clarity rather than political convenience. This is the question for each of us. What are we called to do with our lives? What challenges are we meant to overcome? What work are we meant to accomplish? What freedom are we meant to expand? Lincoln's life answers these questions through example. He shows us that where you come from doesn't have to determine where you go. He shows us that lack of formal education doesn't have to prevent genuine learning. He shows us that ordinary people, through extraordinary effort and moral commitment, can accomplish extraordinary things. Abraham Lincoln died in 1865, but his work didn't end with his death. It continues every time someone stands up for freedom, every time someone fights for justice, every time someone refuses to accept the limitations others place on them, every time someone chooses moral courage over political convenience. That poor boy from a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor became a man who transformed a nation. He proved that greatness is not inherited. It's built. It's earned. It's achieved through work, integrity, and an unshakable commitment to the principles you believe in. His life is America's life. His struggles are our struggles. His victories are our victories. His unfinished work is our work. And so we remember Abraham Lincoln not just as a historical figure, but as a permanent challenge to ourselves, to be better, to do better, to extend freedom further, to bind up wounds, to fight for justice with malice toward none. This is the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. This is why he belongs to the ages. This is why, more than 150 years after his death, his life still calls to us, still inspires us, still demands something of us. The question is, will we answer?